So give everybody a chance to sit down, then we'll begin with the prayer. I thought you were choosing to sit a world away from your husband. He's coming to you. Vicki and I had a fight on the way to church too. Let's go to our Father in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for your many blessings. We know that you are great. We know that you are our Creator, and we know that you love us, and we thank you for that. We'd ask you, Father, to be with us as we look at your church from its beginnings, how you had a plan for us that involved your Son coming to earth, and that he then shared your message with your people through his apostles and through other believers, and that they then in turn shared that message with others. And the church began and is still alive and well today. We'd ask you, Father, to be with us, that each generation would examine your word and that we would try to remain faithful to it. We pray all this in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen. I do not have, it's not my news to share about my daughter, but I will share this one little bit. Her doctor, not the baby's doctor, came in to see her today, and her remark to Meredith was, "You are defying the odds." So that was good news, and we know why she's defying the odds. So she's hanging in there. So if you want any other news, you can see Zach. Okay, we are in church history. We're only in lesson 2, but we're in part 3 of lesson 2. This is on the marks of the early church. We were looking at the people we got. It took us a little long last week because we started with Christ, and then we were going to go to the apostles and then the other leaders and the people that were involved in the first century. And when we got from Christ and him passing on the ability to do miracles to the apostles, I got a little sidetracked on that part, but I think it was important information because it does say a lot. And then Adam asked the question, and he's not here tonight, but when how did the miracles and them ceasing and having the scriptures, how did that coincide and interrelate? And I'm going to put that question off until lesson 3, which probably is not going to be for a week or two. And that's lesson 3 is on the scriptures and the early leaders beyond the apostles. And so when I get to that, I'll try and tie all that in and answer his question then. So I didn't finish the apostles last week on the category of people involved. And we were talking about the apostles. And then I want to point out there was another apostle besides the 12. We had the original 12, and we'll look at their names in just a minute. And then another apostle was added later, Saul of Tarsus, who later was renamed Paul, who became the most prolific traveler, writer, and spokesman of the new church. When I say he was the most prolific traveler, he did make several trips, but he didn't travel the farthest distance if you look at tradition. And we're going to look at some tradition about the apostles in a minute. And I have to stress it's just tradition. Other than what we know about Paul and some of the ones that wrote letters and wrote books, and what we know about, I'm getting ahead of myself. But anyway, there was an apostle that by the name of Thomas, that the tradition says he went as far as India. And in 52 AD, he established the first church in India, 52 AD. And during his life in that one area, he established 7 churches. And then on the other side of India, he established another church. There are 20, as of 2008, according to an article in the National Geographic in 2012, there are 27 million Christians in India that attribute their heritage to Thomas. And there's actually a city in India called St. Thomas, India. So they attribute their beginnings to Thomas. Now, again, that's just a tradition, but it's a very strong tradition. And you'll see some of our traditions are stronger than other ones. In other words, there were 3 apostles that were I'm getting ahead of myself, but I just have to share this kind of. There were 3 apostles that were considered martyred in Rome. Some of the traditions are stronger than others. Does anybody know who those 3 might be? Paul and Peter, that's the tradition, and we'll look at that tradition a little bit more in a minute. The other one you're not going to believe, because this apostle was the one that said the strongest tradition is that he died of old age, probably in Ephesus, John. The tradition, though, and this is a very, how do I say, seripitous? Anyway, it's not very believable. It's thought that he was put in boiling oil and survived, a.k.a. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. So they said that they put him in boiling oil and he came out and survived, and they said, we're not going to try and kill this guy. So he then went on. So that's the traditions are all over the board about the apostles, okay? There's some that are very believable and some of them that are not so believable. But the tradition about Thomas, though, going to India, we tend to remember Thomas from the last thing that the scriptures tell us about Thomas. Can anybody remind us what that is? And I'll repeat it so we don't have to get a microphone for this. But Thomas, the doubter, when he didn't believe that Jesus had risen from the grave. That's the last thing the scriptures tell us about Thomas. And yet the Christians in India have a different take on Thomas. They think of Thomas more as somebody that just wanted proof. And once he got that proof, once he had that concrete proof, once he could touch Jesus' wounds, there was no stopping him. And he became so zealous for the Lord that he went to India and converted people there and started churches and went farther by going to India than Paul did by going to Rome. I think that's true. Something I read said that India, where he went in India, down in the southern tip of India, was farther than Rome was from Jerusalem. Another interesting, and this is just, I probably shouldn't waste this much of my time on this, but Mark was not an apostle, but he did write a gospel. So in a way, you could call him an apostle in the sense that the true meaning of apostle is one sent, and by somebody writing the story of Jesus, you could call him an apostle. But he wasn't considered one of the 12 apostles, I know. But I do want to share this about Mark. Mark, his tradition was, not as an apostle, but his tradition was that he went to Egypt. He went to Alexandria. And he started the church in Egypt, and what later became, from his influence, the Coptic church, which is your Egyptian Christians, okay? When he was martyred there in Alexandria, they buried him in Alexandria, okay? Now then, have any of you been to Italy? Have any of you been to Venice? The patron saint of, now this is because they're Catholics and everything, but the patron saint of Venice is Mark. And I thought, this guy went to Egypt, and Venice had this kind of a third-rate patron saint that was their saint because he was, supposedly killed a dragon. I can't remember the guy's name, but he's not the one that in England that supposedly killed a dragon. But anyway, that was their patron saint, and they were trying to rise their their prestige in the world. I'm talking about the 8th century now, okay? In the 8th century this happened. So they were trying to build up their military, but they were also trying to build up their status in the church. And they thought, if we could get somebody better than this guy over here as our patron saint, and somebody said, how about Mark? So the Doge, maybe mispronouncing it, I keep looking over here where Charles should be, but I know he's not well tonight because, see, if he's grinning, I know I'm mispronouncing something, but that's kind of like the mayor of Venice. He sent these 2 merchants down to Alexandria to dig up and steal Mark's bones. Because, it's just bones at this time because it's, the 8th century. And they go down there, they talk this priest out of these things. The priest must not have been too bright, but they gave him this story, and he gave them these bones. They put them in a barrel and put a bunch of bacon on top of it. Well, maybe not bacon, but it was pork. So that when they tried to leave the port and the Muslims inspected it and they opened it up, and they go, ooh, pig, pig, but that was in Muslim. They didn't say pig, whatever the Muslim word is for them. And they closed it back up. And so they got out of Alexandria. They went to Venice. They put these things in built this big, church basilica around these things, and that became the patron saint of Venice. And other than Rome having their claims, Venice was now all of a sudden this, they had this good military. Now they have this good, story for their, spirituality. So it just elevated Venice to being this important city in the 8th century. And they got some bacon out of it. But you can see how a lot of these traditions really became very important to the people hearing them. Another tradition, they had relics, and that's going to be for a later lesson, but I just had to share this because when I was reading about the apostles, this came up too. They have relics. One of the relics in India from Thomas is about the size of a thumbnail, but it's a piece of a bone that they say is a bone from Thomas. And they've built a reliquary. That's the way the word's spelled. I'm probably mispronouncing it. But, they built this thing all around this little shard of a bone. But somebody said that Thomas was an amazing person because they have identified at least 50 fingers that are fingers that belong to Thomas. among these relics, And there's even a part of the Catholic Church that goes and does testing on all these relics to see if they're at least of the right age and so forth. So anyway, we've got a later lesson in here on doctrinal apostasy and sacraments and so forth. And then but I better get on with my apostles because I'm going to run out of time. Okay, strangely, we only know of 4 apostles very well: Peter, Paul, John, and Matthew, and that's because of their writings. Philip is mentioned in connection with the conversion of the Ethiopian eunuch, but other than these, the New Testament tells us nothing about the rest. And then the writings of these men were passed around, copied and recopied, and became the reference material for the early church. Paul and Peter were the most prominent and attracted the most attention. Okay? And I've got to stop and discuss some things when I get to it, so I need to, I already got past that. So when it says, other than these, the New Testament tells us nothing about the rest. I wanted to make a comment there. Does that mean that the other apostles were not great leaders? No, by no means. I'm not trying to imply that. It just means that we don't know any more about them beyond traditions, and a lot of those traditions were shared by Eusebius back in the 4th century. He wrote about a lot of these guys. I'll share some of these with you. And if any of you subscribe to the National Geographic, and I don't recommend that because the National Geographic, for the most part, is probably an atheist publication, okay? So that's why I am not, but came across this, I think, at a garage sale. And I saw this thing, The Journey of the Apostles. I thought, well, that might be an interesting read. And they had some of this stuff in there about Thomas and so forth. I've got books at home that just, the whole books are just, it's a different chapter on each apostle, which it's kind of hard to have a chapter about Matthias. It's more like a paragraph, you know. Some of these guys, there's just, even the traditions, there's hardly anything about them. But anyway, the Apostle James, of course, was the first one considered martyred. Now, not the first martyr, I didn't say that. He was the first apostle that was a martyr. The first martyr was Stephen in roughly 35 AD. Now, James, it's thought, was martyred in 44 AD, so about 9 years later, okay? And, of course, that was by King Herod, which was Herod Agrippa the First. You know, I got to get all these firsts and greats and all that stuff in there if I'm going to keep up with Charles. And I keep motioning over here because this is where Charles usually sits. He was martyred in 44 AD, so he was the first one to be killed. Then you got Paul in Rome, you know, about 60 to 62 AD, and there's two traditions about Paul. One was that he was never released. You know, he went, you know, Acts tells us that he was, you know, imprisoned, and then they shipped him off to Rome, and there's a lot of Acts, the book of Acts, that talks about that, and he gets to Rome. So one tradition is that he was never released from Rome, and that's where he died. Another tradition was that he was released. He then went on to Gaul, which is our modern Spain. You know, he went on around the Mediterranean, and he preached and was rearrested and was then beheaded on the Ostian Way outside Rome in 64 during the persecution of Nero. Okay, Nero was a wonderful guy, but we'll get to the, I'll save the Caesars for another class. But, you know, if you want to talk about a wicked guy, Nero was it. It's said that he gave a dinner party one time in the gardens of his palace, and when it got dark, he lit the palace with torches. The torches were made out of Christians that were crucified and were dipped in tar so that they would burn longer. I don't share that to gross you out. I just share that to tell you what type of a person he was, you know. Anyway, there's a lot of traditions about Nero too. We're not sure if they're all true or not. But so Eusebius was a Christian who wrote a history of the early church, and so a lot of these things come from him. Peter, it said that one tradition, and this is the untrustworthy tradition about Peter, and you can guess who supports this tradition. He spent 25 years in Rome, founding the church there and acting as its first bishop until his martyrdom. And now I'm not saying that he didn't work in Rome, because it is commonly thought that he worked in Rome, but not for 25 years, and not that he became the first bishop, and not that he founded the church there, you know, necessarily. And it's also not likely that he went there directly from Jerusalem, like Paul did. You know, he had other places that he went before he went to Jerusalem. The New Testament nor Paul mentioned Peter ever visiting Rome. But if you go to 1 Peter 5:13, you know, Peter's own letter, that's, I think 5:13 is the last verse in that letter, or the next to the last verse. It mentions where he's sending greetings to these people that he's writing to, and one of his greetings comes from the sisters in Babylon. And Babylon at this time was not in existence any longer, and Babylon is thought to be a common reference to Rome. Yeah. So that's the only reference we have that, the only writing in the New Testament that implies that he was in Rome. Some people see Revelation chapter 11, verses 3 through 12, where it talks about these two powers and these two people that converted so many people. A lot of people say that could have been Moses and Elijah. Other people see this, and there's nowhere in there it gives their names, that this was referring to Peter and Paul. Go over to Revelation, not right now, I'm not going to read it, but go over to sometime to Revelation 11, verses 3 through 12, and see if you can get Peter and Paul out of that. There may be one verse there that you go, yeah, that kind of sounds like that could be them, because they were these prominent apostles and were teaching lots of people and starting lots of churches, but the other 9 verses, not so much. Okay, so about Peter, Dionysius, this is somebody that Eusebius quotes. He was the bishop in Corinth in 175. He said that Peter and Paul founded the Church of Rome, and both were martyred on the same occasion. Tertullian, also quoted in Eusebius, refers to 3 martyrdoms at Rome: Peter, Paul, and the other one I mentioned, John, who was plunged in boiling oil. But he survived, went on to Ephesus and died there as an old man, about 100 AD. Origen, also quoted by Eusebius, said, at last came to Rome and this is Peter, and was crucified head downwards. He was one of 3 apostles that we know of that the tradition tells us they were crucified upside down. Now, it's not that the Romans decided this is a more devious way to crucify people. What it was, these apostles did not want to share the same death that Jesus did. So they said, if you're going to crucify us, I don't want to be crucified like my Savior. So they said, well, we'll solve that. They turned them upside down. And there were 3 apostles and supposedly the tradition states that was at their request. Gaius of Rome, now this is interesting, and this again is quoted in Eusebius. He uses the terminology of trophies. And we don't tend to think of trophies, but if you go to Washington, D.C., and you go on the mall, what do you see a lot of? Memorials. You see the Washington Monument, it's a memorial to, you see the Lincoln, the Jefferson, the Vietnam, the Korea, all these, they're memorials. They're places you go to remember these people. Think of trophies as memorials. And that's kind of what Gaius of Rome is talking about. He says, places of martyrdom or burial or observation of martyrs. So he refers to the trophies of Peter and Paul. He said, if you go to the Vatican Hill, now by this time you didn't have a Vatican City, but there was a hill that was the Vatican Hill of the 7 hills in Rome. One of them was, the Vatican Hill. Or to the Ostian Way, which was the main road coming into Rome, whether it's from the north or the south, I can't keep my geography straight. When you fly into a city and then you start looking around, you don't know up from down sometimes. But anyway, you will find the trophies of those who founded this church. So they kind of had memorials at these places where these men were supposedly killed. So the conclusion to all of that, if I can wrap this up, Peter did not found the church at Rome or live long in that city. He was not there when Paul wrote to the Romans or when Paul reached Rome, even though a lot of the traditions say that they were killed together. That's not the strongest traditions. He probably, this is Peter now, went to Rome to work the end of his career and had a ministry of limited length there. He probably suffered martyrdom in Rome, as did Paul, but it is much less certain that the 2 men died at the same time. Andrew, let's skip to Andrew now. He was allocated Scythia as his field of his labor. Scythia, I'll save you from looking on a map, but if you find the Black Sea, it's north of the Black Sea. That's Scythia. That's where he went. And because of that, what's above the Black Sea? Ukraine, yeah, but also Russia. He was later on in modern day now, guess who the patron saint of Russia is? Andrew. Okay, so there is some credence to the tradition that's where he went for his mission field. The other thing about these works is there's lots of apocryphal works, the apocryphal Gospel of Thomas, and there's also one called the apocryphal Acts of Andrew. Acts of Andrew kind of has... It was originally called the Acts of Andrew, and it was written by somebody in later centuries to try and, give some credence to some false teachings. But, later on, they changed the name to the Apocryphal Acts of Andrew because it wasn't thought that it had any credence or any reliability. So he evangelized and suffered martyrdom by crucifixion in Achaia, which is modern Greece today. James, now we've got two James. There's James the Lesser and James the Greater. There's James, the son of Zebedee, whose brother was John, and he's James the Greater. So the tradition about him is that he was the only one of the 12 whose martyrdom is related in the New Testament, and I already talked about that. So he was probably the first one to be put to death. Then you got his brother. They're both the sons of Zebedee, John, and he moved to Ephesus and wrote from there, and he died of old age. And during his lifetime, he was banished to Patmos, but he did return. He didn't die in Patmos. And it was from Patmos that he wrote Revelation. He also wrote his gospel. He also wrote his 3 letters. In old age, because he lived up to 100 AD. And the thing is, we don't know how old these guys were when they died, because we don't know how old they were when they started following Jesus. They could have been 20, they could have been 30, they could have been, I don't know, some of them could have been older than that. So we're not sure how old he was, but in old age, when he became too weak to speak in his former vigor and energy, it said that he was carried to meetings with Christians, like on a, what do you call that? Well, a gurney has wheels, but, on a stretcher maybe, kind of a thing. And so that he could go to meetings with Christians. And he said repeatedly, little children, love one another. And if you read the first, his first letter, 1 John, it has that little children in there repeatedly. So, that's not too far of a stretch that was probably. But think of some of our elderly Christians and how benevolent and how kind they are. And how warm and affectionate they speak to us sometimes. I won't mention any names. Shelby's not in here. I'm not saying anything about, I'm not saying Shelby's that old, but who knows? He may be as old as John was when John died in 100 AD. I don't know. But, that's the way I think of John, as being this very affectionate man who was so full of love that's. And when you get old enough, we're going to be celebrating a 100th birthday here pretty soon for somebody in our congregation. When you get old enough, everybody to you is a little children. Jim could probably come up to Nolan and say, you refer to him as a little child. And I don't think Nolan would take offense at that, but, huh? He'd say thank you. Yeah, there you go. Okay, so anyway, Thomas. I kind of told you everything about Thomas. There was a book, apocryphal book called The Acts of Thomas. It wasn't deemed worthy to be in the canon. It was written in the 3rd to the 4th century, so that's part of the problem. It was written too late. But it claims that he worked and suffered martyrdom in India and that his body was carried to Mesopotamia. And today, like I said, there's a St. Thomas in India, and the Christians there claim to be descendants from Thomas. Now, not all 27 million Christians in India claim to be descendants of Thomas, but the Christians that live in St. Thomas claim that. And the thing is, it's not easy being a Christian in India, because India's primary religion is Hindu, and they persecute Christians over there. The article in here in the Reader's Digest, this is from 2012, but most of the information is from 2008. It talked about, in 2008, there were like 60 or 80 Christians that were killed. There were whole villages and towns in India that were predominantly Christians that, because of the persecution, they had to be relocated and moved to another part of India to keep from being executed. So anyway, again, that has nothing to do with the apostles, but I just find this stuff interesting sometimes. So anyway, Thomas, then you got Philip. He's often confused with Philip the evangelist, and we're still, it's unclear what his missionary activities were, but the Acts of Philip, another book, tell of the religious controversy between him and a Judean high priest before the philosophers in Athens. And evidence of the latter part of his life was that he went to Phrygia, which was assigned as his mission field, and if you read the Acts of Philip, that was assigned to him by the risen Christ on the Mount of Olives before he ascended into heaven. He said, Philip, you go to Phrygia. And now, I'm not saying that's tradition, okay? All we're talking about here is tradition. But he died as a martyr Hierapolis by crucifixion, and once again, upside down. Bartholomew, little is known, he's said to have evangelized with Philip and Thomas, and that's all I could find on Bartholomew. Matthew, Eusebius said that he first evangelized among the Hebrews, then among other people. Clement of Alexandria made Matthew a vegetarian. I found that kind of interesting. Why that matters, I don't know, but he just happened to mention, Matthew was a vegetarian. If you watch The Chosen, The Chosen makes him out to be pretty odd. So making him a vegetarian would kind of fit in with that. So maybe it's some of these traditions that they get, for Matthew's oddness. I don't know, but anyway, I don't mean to chase so many rabbits. I'm sorry. It's held that he died a natural death, but late legend dramatized his death by fire or by sword. And that fits more because a lot of the traditions say that John was the only one that died of natural causes. Then you got James, the son of Alphaeus, or James the Less, or James the Lesser. And then you got a book about him called The Martyrdom of St. James, the son of Alphaeus. And it records that James was stoned by the Jews for preaching Christ and was buried by the sanctuary in Jerusalem, which would tend to lead to believe that maybe he died about the same time as the other James, or maybe they were getting the two mixed up. I'm not sure. We don't really know because, again, these are all traditions. Okay, then Thaddeus is said to have been sent by Peter to Edessa and Syria, and his burial place is thought to be either in Beirut or Egypt. And then Simon the Zealot, or Simon the Canaanite, or Simon the Canaanian, Eusebius tells us that he succeeded James, Jesus' brother, as the bishop of Jerusalem, or the elder of Jerusalem. And he suffered martyrdom under Trajan. And then Matthias, the last apostle of the 12, tradition states that he preached in Judea and was stoned by the Jews, and also that he was one of the 70. So, which would make sense, because to be an apostle, you had to, when you look in the book of Acts where they're picking when they're picking baked potatoes and chili is not good for teaching a class. Excuse me. When you look at the tradition, that of picking a new apostle, they had to meet, like 3 qualifications. So if he was there with Jesus, was one of the 70 that Jesus sent out, those 70 were also men that were very involved with the teachings of Jesus and the instructions of Jesus, just like the apostles. It's just they weren't one of the 12, they were one of the 70. So Matthias was thought to have gone from being one of the prominent ones in the 70 to being selected by lot as one of the 12. Why would they use lot? You know what a lot is, where you can do it a number of different ways, but a lot of times you'll take one black stone, and if there's 10 of them, 9 white stones, put them in a jar, shake it up, and reach in there and take one out. And when you get you can do it a number of ways. But when you cast lots for something, you're not taking a vote. This isn't a democratic process. And they thought that by doing that, and I think they were rightfully so, that they are letting God have a part in choosing the next apostle, and not, if it had been left up to vote, how many of the 12 apostles would have been picked that Jesus picked? Probably none of them. We'd get a couple of Pharisees, we'd get a couple of Sadducees, we'd get a couple of priests, we'd get a couple of Levites. They wouldn't have picked these guys, fishermen. They wouldn't have picked these guys. So, if you'd left it up to the other 11 remaining apostles, they probably wouldn't have done a very good job. But, by casting lots, for men that were qualified, they left it up to God. Okay, that's all I've got to say about Matthias. So let's move on now. So the writings of these men were passed around, copied, and recopied. This is what later became our New Testament, along with the Gospels, along with the book of Revelation, along with the book of Acts. Paul and Peter are the most prominent. They attracted the most attention. Because of that, they both wound up in Rome, and I've already talked about that. So at times these men were worshipped mistakenly. If not worshipped, at least they were revered and admired by the believers of the faith or the way, and Paul talks about that. Some of you say you're of Christ, some of you say you're of Paul, some of you say you're of somebody else. That's not important. You shouldn't raise us or elevate us. Their lives were always on the line, especially as the new sect began to grow and was visible outside of Jerusalem. Or Judaism, outside, broader than just Jerusalem. Now you got the other leaders. First mention of other leaders besides apostles, Acts chapter 6. You got these 7 men that are chosen. I won't read through all the names there, but they were chosen to meet the needs of the Hellenistic Jews. They aren't called deacons, but they are the predecessors of what became deacons. They were servants of matters that were not necessarily spiritual, and yet these were spiritual men. Look at Stephen. Tell me Stephen wasn't a spiritual man. He was the first martyr. He died for his belief. And if you read his sermon, he was a godly man. Philip, I have no doubt that all of these men were that same way. Remember our discussion of various elements within the Jews. It's natural that they would have neglected the Hellenistic Jews. But these 7 men were the type of men, even though they weren't Hellenists, they still would have reached out and helped these women because that was the right thing to do. That's the type of men that they were. They weren't called deacons. But later we're going to find those qualifications, and when you read those qualifications and see what they did, they did serve as deacons. So deacons were not officers of the church. In other words, that was not an office. It wasn't a position to be held, as opposed to like an elder or an apostle. But they were men of dependable, unshakable character who could be trusted to take care of a variety of non-spiritual matters. Through Paul, we learn of the appointing of elders by the apostles. We can assume that the other apostles appointed elders just like Paul did, because Paul didn't go to every church. He didn't go to India. It would have been Thomas that would have appointed elders in India. But these men were spiritual officers of the church and had certain qualifications. The elders now is what I'm talking about. And I won't go into that, but if you go to Timothy and Titus, you'll see those qualifications they held. So now when we're talking about elders, these men were also exemplary men like the deacons, revered men of hospitality, self-controlled. Again, this is just quoting from Timothy and Titus. Gentle, deeply committed. They were also called shepherds, bishops, or presbyters, but all those names were equivalent. Now then, the problem's going to be with only cultural background distinctions, depending upon what part of the world you were in, whether you called them bishops or shepherds or presbyters. And when we get into the organization of the church, we'll get into the distinction between elders and bishops later on. But in the early church, the first century, there was no distinction between these. They were all the same. And that's what I'm trying to point out here, so that when we get into later centuries, we can say, okay, here's how the church started. It was like this, but now here's how it changed, and we can compare. From studying the text of the New Testament, these were the only officials. When I say these, I'm talking about elders that we know of. However, James, the brother of Jesus, occupied a place of prominence in the Jerusalem church. He was not an apostle. We can only assume that he was an elder. But they didn't call him Elder James, or James the Elder, is probably the way they would have referred to him, possibly, but they just called him James. So, his words did carry great weight, though, because of the way his behavior in the church. I went too far. So we don't know the official status of men in the New Testament, like Mark, Luke, gospel writers, Jude, Barnabas, Silas, Apollos. These men may have been elders, they may have been deacons, but we don't. But the point is, they don't have to be an elder or a deacon to be a great Christian. And I want to, if we run out of time, I want to leave you with that. You don't have to be an elder to be a great Christian. You don't have to be a deacon. You don't have to hold any sort of position or office in the church to be a good Christian. As far as pomp and formalities go, there was no distinction between the elders and the regular converts. Because an elder was just a servant. And if he's truly serving others, he's not going to elevate himself above them. He's going to be more likely to wash their feet, as an example that Jesus gave to his apostles. So we get a picture of an informal, flexible organization with few trappings of office. Now, when we get into later centuries, that's going to change. Okay. I really had. I wanted to talk about I'll stop there. I'll stop there because I don't want to open a can of worms at 7:40. Thank you for your attention. I tried to look for hands. I didn't see anybody with a question. I talk so fast sometimes you're going to have to wave your hand maybe to get my attention, but I welcome questions. So I even got guys back there with microphones that were supposed to be looking for you. So any final comments before we dismiss the class? Well, I have to balance my chasing rabbits with what I'm trying to accomplish here. And I chase rabbits because I find these, if you can't tell, I find this stuff fascinating and exciting to me. And I'm sorry if I get wound up, but I do sometimes. But thank you very much.